The Arctic, a frozen wilderness stretching across the top of the world, where temperatures plunge below -40 and the sun disappears for months at a time. For centuries, it was considered untouchable, a barren frontier too hostile for nations to fight over. But today, that icy expanse is no longer a silent void. It's becoming the stage for one of the most dangerous geopolitical games on Earth. NATO has quietly expanded its presence in the far north. Russia has built bases on islands that used to be little more than snow and rock. And both Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin have said, in different words, the same thing. The Arctic could be the next flashpoint for global conflict. So why would world leaders, already entangled in wars and crises elsewhere, turn their eyes to a frozen ocean? The answer is simple: power, survival, and resources. Beneath the Arctic ice lies a fortune: oil, gas, minerals, resources that could power economies for generations. And as the ice melts faster than ever before, those resources are becoming accessible. That means nations who control the Arctic don't just control land, they control the future. And everyone knows it. NATO's Arctic operations began as quiet training exercises. Small units deployed to Norway, practicing survival in sub-zero conditions. Naval patrols weaving through icy waters under the excuse of freedom of navigation. Surveillance aircraft mapping the frozen sky. But as the years passed, those missions grew. What was once a training ground is now a forward operating theater. NATO soldiers train in caves and mountains to simulate fighting in temperatures where guns jam and fuel turns to sludge. Warships slice through the North Atlantic, rehearsing how to cut off Russian subs from slipping beneath the ice. The alliance frames it as defensive readiness. Putin calls it provocation, and Donald Trump once flatly described it as a flashpoint, the kind of place where a single misstep could light the fuse of something bigger. From Putin's perspective, the Arctic isn't a blank canvas. It's part of Russia's homeland. Nearly half the Arctic's coastline belongs to Russia, stretching across Siberia to the Barents Sea. Moscow has poured billions into militarizing it. Airstrips, missile sites, radar stations. Old Soviet bases that were abandoned in the 1990s have been rebuilt with modern technology. Russia now has more icebreakers, ships capable of carving paths through frozen seas, than the rest of the world combined. To Putin, this isn't aggression, it's protection. In his view, Russia's Arctic is both shield and sword. A shield against NATO encroachment, and a sword that can project power across the Atlantic or into Europe if war ever breaks out. But the story doesn't stop at Russia. Trump, during his presidency, surprised allies when he called the Arctic strategic real estate. He famously floated the idea of buying Greenland, a suggestion that was mocked at the time but revealed his mindset. He saw the Arctic not as an afterthought, but as a high-stakes chessboard. To him, it wasn't a frozen wasteland. It was a gateway to trade routes, a vault of resources, and a flank in the confrontation with Russia and China. Trump warned that hesitation in the Arctic could be catastrophic, because once your enemy builds fortresses on the ice, removing them becomes almost impossible. His words struck a chord because they echoed what NATO generals had quietly feared. The Arctic isn't just about nature anymore. It's about survival in the next war. Imagine this scenario. A NATO submarine patrols under the Arctic ice, tracking Russian movements. Above, a Russian bomber flies close to Norwegian airspace, testing NATO's response times. Both sides claim they're just training, but all it takes is one radar misread, one pilot too close, one submarine surfacing in the wrong place, and suddenly a frozen sea becomes the site of a live confrontation. That's why Trump called it Flashpoint. The Arctic doesn't need a declaration of war to become a battlefield. It just needs a mistake, and the stakes keep rising. Climate change, ironically, is the accelerator. As ice recedes, new shipping routes are opening. The Northern Sea Route, which snakes along Russia's Arctic coast, can cut travel time from Asia to Europe in half compared to the Suez Canal. That means whoever controls those lanes doesn't just control trade. They control the arteries of the global economy. Putin sees that as Russia's birthright. NATO sees it as too dangerous to ignore. And China, even though it has no Arctic territory, has declared itself a near-Arctic state and invested heavily in shipping and exploration. The race isn't about who can survive the cold. It's about who can profit from its thaw. NATO's response has been to harden its northern flank. Norway has become a hub for Allied operations, with American Marines rotating through bases and drills in the Arctic Circle. Britain has invested in submarines designed to operate under ice. Canada, often quiet on global affairs, has stepped up patrols through its northern territories, insisting that sovereignty in the Arctic is not negotiable. Meanwhile, joint exercises now bring together forces from across the alliance, rehearsing everything from paratrooper drops on frozen tundra to coordinated naval maneuvers in seas choked with icebergs. These are not just drills. They are signals, loud and clear, that NATO is prepared to defend its claim to the north. For Putin, every NATO exercise feels like a direct threat. Russia's doctrine sees the Arctic as a war zone waiting to happen. In his speeches, he frames it as existential. If Russia loses the Arctic, it loses security, wealth, and global influence. That's why his military strategy has layered defenses across the region, with radar domes peering across the ice and missile batteries, capable of striking ships or planes that come too close. He wants to make the Arctic a fortress, where NATO's every move is observed, and every incursion can be met with overwhelming force. The danger is that both sides see their moves as defensive. NATO says it's preparing to defend allies. Russia says it's protecting its borders. But in the Arctic, defense and offense are separated by inches. A radar built for early warning can also guide missiles. A submarine meant for deterrence can also launch an attack. And in a place where visibility is low, communication is fragile, and survival is already difficult, the margin for error is terrifyingly small. Trump's Flashpoint warning comes back to this reality. He argued that the Arctic isn't like the Middle East or the Pacific. It's not a theater you can pull out from or negotiate away. Once militarized, it becomes permanent. You can't melt bases built on ice. You can't ignore submarines patrolling beneath the frozen ocean. The Arctic, once contested, stays contested. And that means the decisions being made now, by NATO generals, by Putin in Moscow, by policymakers in Washington, will echo for decades. And so, as NATO's Arctic operations expand, the world finds itself staring at a chilling question. How close are we to a mistake that changes everything? The Arctic is no longer silent. It hums with radar signals, submarine engines, and political tension. Every convoy, every patrol, every exercise carries the weight of history. Because if the next world war ever begins in the north, it will not come with warning. It will come suddenly in the silence of snow, on a battlefield no one ever expected to matter. When NATO commanders talk about the Arctic today, they no longer describe it as a training ground. They describe it as a front line. That shift tells you everything about how fast this frozen region has gone from forgotten to vital. What used to be a handful of military drills in Norway has become full-scale operations involving navies, air forces, and entire battalions. NATO's goal is clear. Make sure that if Russia turns the Arctic into a war zone, the alliance won't be caught unprepared. But that preparation carries risks of its own. On the Russian side, the buildup is even more dramatic. Over the last decade, Moscow has reactivated more than 50 Soviet-era bases, stretching from the Kola Peninsula near Norway all the way across Siberia. Airstrips long buried in snow now host fighter jets and bombers. Radar domes watch the skies around the clock. Entire garrisons are stationed on islands where no one used to live. These aren't just symbolic outposts. They're heavily armed, with surface-to-air missiles, anti-ship systems, and troops trained to fight in conditions that would kill most soldiers in hours. Putin wants NATO to look north and think twice before even considering a move. And here's the chilling part. NATO is doing the exact same thing. The United States has stepped up deployments of bombers to Alaska, positioning them so they can reach the Arctic and beyond within hours. Submarines from Britain, France, and the U.S. practice surfacing through ice, sometimes breaking through within miles of Russian waters. Allied troops train for winter combat, leaping from planes into frozen tundra with gear designed to keep them alive just long enough to fight. Every exercise sends a message, but messages can be misread. Trump, during his presidency, often warned that the Arctic was where hesitation kills. What he meant is that the environment leaves no room for mistakes. If a pilot hesitates, his plane ices over. If a ship hesitates, it gets trapped in frozen seas. And if a political leader hesitates, the enemy fills the gap. That's why he pushed for stronger NATO presence in the north, even if some European allies rolled their eyes at the costs. Trump's argument was simple. Once Putin locks down the Arctic, the alliance will spend 10 times as much trying to take it back. From Putin's point of view, this is not paranoia, it's strategy. Russia's entire nuclear deterrent relies heavily on its bastion in the Arctic. Hidden beneath the ice are nuclear submarines, armed with missiles that can reach Washington or London in minutes. For Moscow, those submarines are the ultimate insurance policy. If NATO ever struck first, Russia could retaliate from under the ice. That's why Putin treats the Arctic as sacred ground. To him, NATO exercises are not just training. They are rehearsals for cutting off Russia's nuclear lifeline. And that, in his logic, makes every drill an act of aggression. But there's more at stake than nukes. The Arctic is also becoming a competition over shipping routes and energy. The Northern Sea route, along Russia's coast, has already seen dozens of cargo ships making trips that once would have been impossible. By the 2030s, experts believe it could rival the Suez Canal as a major artery of global trade. For Putin, controlling that route means controlling the flow of goods between Asia and Europe. For NATO, allowing Russia that control would be like letting Moscow hold a knife to the throat of global commerce. This is where China enters the picture. Beijing has no Arctic coastline, no bases in the far north, but it has money and ambition. It has declared itself a near-Arctic state, a term that raised eyebrows in Washington and Brussels. Through investments in Russian shipping projects, energy infrastructure, and scientific stations, China is quietly buying influence in the Arctic. That partnership worries NATO almost as much as Russia itself, because if Putin has the icebreakers and China has the cash, together they could dominate the North in ways the West might struggle to counter. Trump pointed this out when he floated the idea of buying Greenland. People laughed, but his logic was blunt. Better to own a strategic foothold outright than watch rivals slowly box you out. So how does NATO respond? By trying to create resilience across the entire alliance. In Norway, U.S. Marines live in caves stocked with tanks and ammunition, ready to deploy at a moment's notice. In Iceland, air patrols keep watch over the North Atlantic. In Canada, military exercises stretch across the tundra, ensuring troops know how to fight where GPS signals falter and compasses spin uselessly near the magnetic pole. And in Washington, war games simulate what happens if Russia moves first, if it launches a surprise strike on a NATO outpost, or if its submarines cut undersea cables that carry internet across the Atlantic. The results of those war games are rarely published, but the whispers that leak out tell one story. The Arctic is where NATO feels most vulnerable. For ordinary people, this might feel distant, almost unreal. Why fight over ice and snow when there are so many crises elsewhere? But history is full of places that seemed irrelevant until they became central. In 1914, few people thought a gunshot in Sarajevo would ignite a global war. In 1939, most believed Hitler would stop after Poland. Today, many believe the Arctic is too hostile, too remote to matter. But leaders like Trump and Putin disagree, and their disagreement is shaping reality on the ground. The danger lies in how easy it would be for a standoff to spiral. Picture this. A NATO exercise in Norway sends ships north to test maneuvers. A Russian submarine shadows them, surfacing suddenly within visual range. Alarms blare, missiles are locked, orders fly across radios. Neither side wants war, but neither wants to back down. In the Arctic, where communication is slow, visibility is poor, and mistrust runs deep, seconds can feel like hours. And in those seconds, the line between exercise and escalation blurs. Trump called the Arctic a flashpoint because he understood this dynamic. He saw how both sides frame their actions as defensive, yet how easily those defenses overlap into offense. Putin sees NATO patrols as encroachment. NATO sees Russian bases as intimidation. And between those perceptions lies a battlefield waiting to be lit. Meanwhile, every year the ice shrinks. Every year the competition grows. And every year the Arctic becomes less of a frontier and more of a stage. NATO commanders insist their mission is stability. Putin insists his mission is sovereignty. Trump insisted hesitation would be fatal. But in the end, they're all talking about the same truth. The Arctic is no longer empty. It's crowded, it's contested, and it's fragile. That fragility is what makes it so dangerous. A mistake in the Middle East or Asia can be managed. A mistake in the Arctic can spiral before anyone has time to react. Because in the North, there is no buffer, no margin, no second chance. There's only the ice, the cold, and the shadows of nuclear submarines beneath them. As the ice melts and the competition intensifies, the Arctic is no longer the world's frozen edge. It is the front line of tomorrow's conflicts. NATO calls its presence defensive, a way to reassure allies and deter aggression. Putin calls it provocation, an excuse to encircle Russia and undermine its sovereignty. Trump called it a flashpoint because he believed one misstep here could set off a chain reaction far bigger than the ice itself. And in a sense, they are all right. For NATO, the challenge is credibility. If the alliance says it will defend its northern members, then it must prove it with ships, aircraft, and troops on the ground. For Russia, the challenge is control. Moscow cannot allow NATO to operate freely near its nuclear bastion without responding, without showing that the North belongs to them. And for Trump, the challenge was clarity. He insisted that hesitation, political, military, or economic, would be the deadliest mistake in a region where seconds matter more than speeches. What makes the Arctic so dangerous is that it is not just a military puzzle. It is an environmental one, an economic one, and a technological one. Climate change has turned once impassable seas into shipping lanes. Global markets have turned untapped oil and gas reserves into irresistible prizes. And modern technology has made the region both more accessible and more vulnerable. Satellites watch every move. Submarines patrol under the ice. Cyber operations probe communication networks that were once thought untouchable. The North is no longer isolated. It is connected to everything. And that's why a spark here could ignite a fire everywhere. Imagine a NATO patrol misreading a Russian exercise, or a Russian bomber straying too close to Norwegian airspace. Imagine an oil tanker struck by accident in the Barents Sea, or a submarine cable cut by sabotage. Each of these moments could be dismissed as a mistake, or escalated into a crisis. In the Arctic, ambiguity is a weapon. One Putin uses to keep the West guessing, and one Trump warned would test NATO's resolve to its core. The stakes are higher than just territory. Whoever controls the Arctic shapes the balance of global power. Control means securing energy flows, controlling shipping lanes, and safeguarding nuclear deterrence. It means having the ability to pressure rivals without firing a shot. And it means being ready for a war that may never be declared, but that could unfold silently in the markets, in the energy grid, in the invisible networks of satellites and submarines. For the rest of the world, the danger is being pulled into a conflict they cannot control. Europe depends on Arctic stability for energy. Asia depends on Arctic shipping routes for trade. North America depends on Arctic defenses for deterrence. No nation can afford to ignore the region, yet no nation can fully secure it. That imbalance is what makes it the most fragile flashpoint on Earth. Trump's blunt warnings and Putin's aggressive buildup may sound like opposites, but together they describe the same reality. The Arctic is now a battlefield of perception. Whoever convinces the world they hold the upper hand, in strength, in resolve, in survival, wins without firing a shot. But if both sides miscalculate, if both sides decide they cannot afford to look weak, then the ice may not stay silent for long. So what does the future hold? More drills, more bases, more rhetoric. NATO will keep pushing north to show solidarity. Russia will keep fortifying its bastion to show dominance. China will keep investing to gain a foothold. and the rest of the world will keep watching, hoping that this new front line stays cold rather than hot. Yet beneath all the strategy, all the speeches, all the posturing, lies one simple truth. The Arctic is changing faster than politics can adapt. Ice is melting, routes are opening, and the world's powers are racing to claim what they can before it's too late. In that race, accidents are inevitable, and in that inevitability lies the risk of escalation. Trump once said that the Arctic would decide whether the next world war was won or lost before it even began. Putin has said that whoever controls the Arctic controls the future. Between those two visions lies a fragile peace, one that grows thinner as the ice does. And so, as convoys roll across frozen tundra and submarines glide beneath the silent seas, the question isn't whether the Arctic matters. The question is how long it can stay a flashpoint without turning into a firestorm. Because in the end, the North Pole is no longer just a point on a map. It is the place where the fate of nations could be decided, not with headlines, not with treaties, but with a single mistake in the coldest, most unforgiving battlefield on Earth.